The abrasive wind of the Egyptian desert in the late summer of 1942 carried the sting of sand and the bitter metallic scent of a shattered army. Following the disastrous battles of the Gazala Line and the shocking fall of the fortress of Tobruk, the British Eighth Army had been driven back to the very gates of Alexandria, halting Rommel's Afrika Korps at a dusty railway halt named El Alamein only through sheer desperate attrition. The armored regiments of the British Army had been decimated in the rolling tank battles of the Western Desert. The men who crewed the British armor, the veterans of the Royal Tank Regiment and the cavalry regiments, were exhausted, cynical, and deeply distrustful of their own machinery. To understand the profound psychological and tactical shock that the arrival of the American M4 Sherman delivered to these men, one must deeply examine the horrifying operational reality they had endured for the previous 2 years. The British armored doctrine had bifurcated its tank development into two distinct categories: the slow, heavily armored infantry tanks like the Matilda and the Valentine, and the fast, lightly armored cruiser tanks like the A-15 Crusader. Both categories, however, suffered from a fatal combination of mechanical unreliability and catastrophic underarmament. The Crusader tank, which formed the backbone of the British armored brigades during the mobile desert campaigns, was a machine that inspired a dark, morbid humor among its crews. Powered by a Nuffield Liberty engine, a design that essentially dated back to the aircraft of the First World War, the Crusader was notoriously prone to overheating, breaking its fan belts and catching fire under the punishing ambient temperatures of the Sahara. A British tank commander leading a squadron of Crusaders into action could statistically expect up to 1/3 of his vehicles to break down before they even crossed the line of departure. But the mechanical fragility was only half of the nightmare. The primary armament of the early Crusaders and the infantry tanks was the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, a 40mm anti-tank gun. In the early days of the war, this gun was adequate for piercing the thin armor of Italian tanks or the early German Panzer IIs and IIIs. However, as the Desert War evolved, the German Afrika Korps introduced up armored Panzer IIIs and the deadly long-barreled Panzer IV Special. More importantly, Rommel mastered the use of the dreaded 88mm anti-aircraft gun deployed in a horizontal anti-tank role. The fatal flaw of the British 2-pounder and even its replacement, the 57mm 6-pounder, was not just a lack of armor-penetrating power but a complete lack of a high explosive capability. British armored doctrine stubbornly dictated that tanks were meant to fight other tanks, and therefore they were issued almost exclusively with solid armor-piercing shot. When a British tank squadron advanced across the flat, featureless desert and encountered a screen of concealed German anti-tank guns, they possessed no mechanism to suppress or destroy the soft targets. The solid steel shot simply buried itself in the sand or punched clean through the gun shields without causing explosive damage to the crew. British tankers were forced to attempt suicidal charges against the anti-tank screens, trying to close the range enough to use their Besa machine guns, all while being systematically picked off by the high-velocity 88mm shells that could tear the turret off a Crusader from 2,000 yards away. It was a tactical environment that bred a deep, pervasive sense of numerical and technological inferiority. The arrival of the American M3 Grant tank in early 1942 had provided a brief, vital reprieve. The Grant, equipped with a sponson-mounted 75mm gun, finally gave the British the ability to fire high-explosive shells at the German anti-tank gunners, saving the Eighth Army from total collapse at Gazala. However, the Grant was an awkward stopgap measure. Its main gun could only traverse a few degrees, requiring the entire tank to turn to engage a target, and its towering silhouette made it highly visible across the desert floor. It was a necessary compromise, but it was not the ultimate weapon the British needed to take the offensive. Following the fall of Tobruk, an emergency allocation of 300 newly manufactured M4 Sherman tanks was authorized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, plucked directly from the American production lines and shipped to the Middle East. When these freighters arrived at the docks of Port Tawfiq in Egypt in August and September of 1942, the British tank crews who were pulled from the front lines to receive them were entirely unprepared for the mechanical revelation that was about to be handed to them. When the British tankers first laid eyes on the Sherman sitting on the sun-baked docks, their immediate reaction was a mixture of awe and profound relief. The silhouette of the tank was entirely different from the low, angular lines of the British cruisers or the multi-tiered awkwardness of the Grant. The M4A1 models featured a massive, continuously cast steel hull that gave the vehicle a smooth, rounded appearance, while the M4A2 models featured a cleanly welded, angular hull. The tank sat high on its volute spring suspension, towering over the men who walked around it. This height was an initial point of concern for veterans accustomed to seeking defilade in the shallow desert depressions, but the sheer imposing mass of the vehicle communicated a sense of industrial solidity that the riveted plates of the Crusaders had never conveyed. The American tanks arrived painted in a fresh coat of olive drab, smelling strongly of cosmoline grease, high-octane aviation fuel, and the canvas of their pristine tarpaulins. They looked less like bespoke handcrafted instruments of war and more like the mass-produced products of a highly advanced, unstoppable automotive industry. As the British crews climbed the steel cleats of the tracks and dropped down through the hatches into the fighting compartment, the contrast with their previous vehicles became startlingly clear. The interior of a British tank was typically a cramped, dark, and highly dangerous environment. The bare steel walls were often unpainted or coated in a dull silver, the air was thick with cordite and engine fumes, and the internal mechanisms were exposed, waiting to catch a loose uniform or shatter a kneecap during a violent maneuver. The interior of the Sherman, by contrast, was painted a bright, stark white, instantly illuminating the fighting compartment. It was astonishingly spacious. The commander, gunner, and loader occupying the turret had room to move, stretch their limbs, and operate their equipment without constantly interfering with one another. The ergonomics of the machine had clearly been designed with the human operator in mind. The edges of the equipment were smooth, the seats were padded and adjustable, and the dials and gauges of the instrument panels were laid out with the logical clarity of an aircraft cockpit. Perhaps the most astonishing interior feature to the British crews was the inclusion of a full turret basket. In the Crusader and the Grant, the turret crew essentially stood or sat on seats attached to the turret ring while their feet rested on the stationary hull floor. When the turret traversed, the men had to frantically shuffle their feet to avoid having their legs sheared off by the rotating machinery. In the Sherman, the floor of the turret was suspended from the ring itself, creating an enclosed basket. When the commander ordered a traverse, the entire floor moved with the turret. The gunner and loader simply stood in place, moving seamlessly with the weapon. This simple mechanical addition drastically reduced the physical fatigue of the crew and allowed for much faster and more coordinated engagement of targets during the chaotic maneuvering of a desert battle. The attention to detail extended to the electrical systems. The Sherman was equipped with highly reliable radios, an internal intercom system that actually functioned without constant static, and even small conveniences like internal lighting, and a highly effective ventilation fan designed to suck the toxic cordite smoke out of the turret after firing, saving the crew from asphyxiation during prolonged engagements. But the true awakening occurred when the British drivers settled into their compartments and hit the starter switches. The early Shermans delivered to the 8th Army were powered either by the massive 9-cylinder Wright R975 Whirlwind radial engine, a powerplant originally designed for aircraft, or the twin General Motors 671 diesel engines in the Sherman 3 variants. When the starter engaged, the radial engine would spew a thick cloud of blue smoke from the exhaust and then settle into a deep, powerful, rhythmic roar. The mechanical reliability of these powerplants was something the British crews had never experienced. A Crusader required constant, delicate maintenance and a profound degree of mechanical luck simply to complete a road march. The Sherman engines were designed to be turned on, driven hard for hundreds of miles, shut down and turned on again the next day without catastrophic failure. The synchromesh transmission shifted smoothly compared to the agonizing crash boxes of the British tanks, allowing the driver to maintain speed and momentum over the rough terrain. The rubber block tracks, a vast improvement over the all-steel links of the British designs, provided a smoother ride, reduced the internal vibration that shattered the nerves of the crews, and offered excellent traction on the hard-packed sand and rocky outcroppings of the desert floor. The most critical and celebrated aspect of the Sherman, however, was its main armament. The 75mm M3 gun mounted in the fully traversing turret was the absolute answer to the tactical prayers of the 8th Army. For the British gunners who had spent years squinting through the optics of the 2-pounder, the 75mm weapon was a revelation of destructive power. It possessed adequate armor-piercing capability, able to defeat the frontal armor of the standard Panzer III and Panzer IV models encountered in the desert at combat ranges of 1,000 yards. But more importantly, it fired a massive, highly lethal, high-explosive shell. The British tankers finally possessed a weapon capable of projecting explosive force outward. When the gunner loaded an HE shell and fired at a concealed German anti-tank screen, the resulting detonation would tear through the gun shields, shatter the optics, and eliminate the crews. The tactical paradigm of the Desert War was instantly inverted. The British armor was no longer forced to execute suicidal charges against the 88s. They could halt outside the effective range of the smaller German anti-tank guns and systematically dismantle the German defensive lines with accurate high-explosive fire. The mechanism by which this fire was delivered was also a technological marvel to the British. The Sherman turret was powered by a highly responsive electro-hydraulic traverse system. The gunner controlled the movement not by frantically cranking a heavy handwheel but by manipulating a pistol grip control. A slight twist of the wrist would send the heavy turret spinning rapidly, smoothly acquiring targets in a fraction of the time required by a manually traversed British turret. Furthermore, the Sherman was equipped with the Westinghouse gyrostabilizer. While many British crews initially misunderstood this complex piece of electromechanical engineering and often disabled it, fearing it would drain the batteries or malfunction, those who learned to properly calibrate and utilize the stabilizer found it provided a massive advantage. It was not designed to allow the tank to fire accurately while driving at top speed, a common misconception, but rather to keep the gun elevation relatively stable as the tank moved over rough ground. This allowed the gunner to keep the target in his sights and fire the very instant the tank braked to a short halt, allowing the Sherman to invariably get the critical first shot off in a meeting engagement. The combat debut of the Sherman with the British Eighth Army at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 solidified its reputation forever. As the massive artillery barrage lifted and the armored brigades pushed through the minefields known as the Devil's Gardens, the Shermans led the assault. The British commanders, previously cautious and conservative due to the fragility of their equipment, found that they could push the Shermans relentlessly. The tanks absorbed the punishing environment, the choking dust, the intense heat, and the continuous operational tempo without breaking down. When they finally engaged the heavy armor of the Afrika Korps, the 21st and 15th Panzer Divisions, the Shermans proved to be the decisive instrument of victory. The thick frontal armor of the Sherman could withstand the hits from the standard 50mm guns of the German tanks, while the 75mm guns of the Shermans tore through the German formations. The ability of the Sherman turrets to rapidly traverse and engage multiple targets in the swirling, chaotic dust clouds of the desert melee proved vastly superior to the slower, more cumbersome German machines. Following the victory at El Alamein and the subsequent relentless pursuit of Rommel's shattered army across the expanse of Libya and Tunisia, the phrase "sun compasses and Shermans" became the defining mantra of the British armored forces. The profound psychological shift cannot be overstated. The British tanker who had previously climbed into his Crusader expecting it to break down or expecting to be outgunned by an invisible enemy now climbed into a machine he implicitly trusted. He knew that when he pushed the starter the engine would fire. He knew that when he traversed the turret the hydraulic fluid would drive the gears. He knew that when he pulled the trigger the 75mm shell would solve the tactical problem in front of him. The Sherman did not merely replace the British tanks, it completely redefined the operational capabilities of the entire Eighth Army, allowing commanders like Montgomery to execute deep sustained mechanized thrusts that would have been logistically and mechanically impossible just 6 months prior. Of course, the British crews quickly learned the harsh realities and the specific vulnerabilities of their new machines as the war progressed from the open desert to the mountainous terrain of Italy and the dense hedgerows of Normandy. The high profile of the Sherman made it difficult to fully conceal in a hull-down position, making it an attractive target for the increasingly powerful German anti-tank weapons. The early models of the Sherman, equipped with dry ammunition stowage bins located in the sponsons above the tracks, demonstrated a terrifying tendency to violently ignite and brew up if the tank was penetrated by an armor-piercing shell, a flaw that led to grim nicknames, though the statistical reality of these fires was heavily skewed by the massive volume of Shermans in combat compared to other types. But even recognizing these flaws, the British assessment of the Sherman remained overwhelmingly pragmatic and positive. They understood that warfare is an industrial enterprise, and the Sherman was the ultimate triumph of industrial design applied to the battlefield. It was a tank that was good enough to fight the enemy, reliable enough to reach the battlefield, and manufactured in such staggering astronomical numbers that the British Army was never again short of armored vehicles. As the German army introduced its massive heavy tanks, the Tiger and the Panther, which possessed armor and firepower that significantly outclassed the standard 75mm Sherman, the British did not abandon the American vehicle. Instead, utilizing the incredible mechanical versatility and internal spaciousness of the Sherman design, they engineered one of the most lethal hybrid weapons of the Second World War, the Sherman Firefly. By meticulously rotating the radio equipment, modifying the recoil mechanisms, and redesigning the loader hatch, British engineers managed to shoehorn the massive, incredibly powerful Ordnance QF 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the standard Sherman turret. The 17-pounder, firing specialized discarding sabot ammunition, was one of the few Allied weapons capable of reliably penetrating the frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther tank at standard combat ranges. The Firefly became the highly valued apex predator of the British armored regiments in northwest Europe, seamlessly integrated into troops alongside standard 75mm Shermans, providing the heavy overwatch and the armor-penetrating punch required to break the heavy German defensive lines. The legacy of the Sherman tank in British service is a profound testament to the vital importance of mechanical reliability, ergonomic design, and logistical abundance in modern warfare. When those exhausted, dust-covered British crews first inspected the freshly painted American tanks on the docks of Egypt, they were looking at the instrument that would physically carry them from the brink of total defeat in Africa all the way to the final victory parades in the ruined streets of Berlin. They did not speak of the Sherman with the romanticized reverence often reserved for the Spitfire or the Lancaster bomber. They spoke of it with the deep professional respect of a mechanic evaluating a perfectly designed tool. They praised its dependability, its automotive excellence, its roomy interior, and the absolute devastating utility of its dual-purpose gun. The Sherman tank gave the British armored forces the mechanical foundation upon which they rebuilt their shattered confidence, allowing them to dictate the tempo of the war and ultimately crush the fascist empires beneath the steel cleats of millions of American-manufactured tracks.